Welcome back to another YouTube video, and we're going to continue within the Q&A series and just general topics this time. Last time I did more of a gut cut approach one. This one's just going to be back to general topics. If ever you would like to ask questions, I always pose the question submission on my Instagram stories, so make sure to be able to check that out. But without further ado, let's get straight into the first question, which is, in your opinion, what are the worst programming mistakes coaches make? So I'm going to slightly adjust this one just to the main issues I see coaches make or mistakes versus like the biggest, because frankly, the biggest mistake you can make is just being a really, really crappy coach and having no idea what you can do. But let's do more generalized ones where we can take like people who look like they are doing a good job coaching. What are the mistakes they're making that I think are the worst ones? And the first one kind of relates back to a question I had last Q&A, or last general Q&A, where I talked about a big thing coaches should know more about is injury and rehab, is when a coach has an athlete who gets injured due to a workload-related issue, that when the athlete is now healthy, they just put them back on the same program again. And the athlete gets injured again, they get healthy, and then they put them back on the same program again. I see this way too often. We see the same athletes get the same injuries over and over and over. Now, within powerlifting, you are going to experience some types of aches and pains and injuries. It's going to happen. I have athletes get hurt frequently. It's going to happen, and it does not mean you are a bad coach. But if you are having that happen, and it's a workload-related issue, and you can identify that, and you're not making adjustments, and we're just repeating the same thing over and over, that is a major mistake that you're making. The next one is a bit less egregious, just more an opinion I have, but it's something I've touched on frequently, is just making too many changes. Either one, just changing things to change things with no real rhyme or reason. Maybe it's working and you're just going, we're just going to do something new. Don't, it's working. Keep going forward with what you find is going well. But second, probably more common, this goes back to the video I did on Powerlifting Now on the updated approach to block periodization, is making too many changes at once versus making one or two small scale or micro changes, testing how those changes go, and then adjusting further from there. Because if you make too many changes at once, you have no idea which change or variable you tweaked is actually causing the result you see. So you want to make very, very small adjustments when you do so. And the last big issue I see, again, very much my opinion, is people who very much neglect or underrate accessory work, or the general camps that state, oh, accessory work isn't that important within powerlifting. Again, my opinion, but I don't get that. It doesn't really make sense to me. The fact is, I mean, we can just, the eye test, we can see that the people who are the best in the world within their weight classes are very jacked. Now you could say that's genetics, you could say they were going to get there anyways, but accessory work is a great, great additional tool we can use to get more specialized or specific work to certain targeted muscles while reducing the fatigue cost of it, as well as getting some movement variability. So we're not just moving in the same planes over and over and over. Now, if you just squat, bench, and deadlift and do minimal accessory work, I'm sure you can get strong. That's the main argument is, oh, these people are still getting strong. I just think it's a better route to get there with really, really utilizing the strengths and the variability that accessory work can offer in regards to the hypertrophy that we can get from that without inducing the same fatigue costs, as well as the movement variability we can get from that with likely reducing workload-related issues by not just moving the same compounded patterns over and over and over with squat, bench, and deadlift. So for the next question, I actually read this one wrong initially, and I'm going to stick with how I read it wrong because I like the topic that I want to get into. But the original question is, what current training trend do you see being the current or next flash in the pan? I read it as, what trend do you see as kind of being like the one that's going to be fleeting and is a bit of a fad right now. So I'm going to roll with that. So what training trend do I see as a possible fad? My opinion, anything AI based. And the reason being is coaching has a big soft skill element and psychological element to it that I don't think AI, at least in the realm of what the application will be to powerlifting, can ever really replace or replicate. And what I mean by that is, one, soft skills within a coach in the sense of being able to relate personality-wise to someone and being able to talk to them, and the idea of being able to connect with an interpersonal relationship that's not going to be replaced through AI. But even more so, and something I've talked about in many, many videos, is how important lifter psychology goes into programming and how you organize training based off lifter psychology to get the intended execution of the program. And that's something that maybe AI in the future can be able to replicate to an extent. But the fact is, we're in powerlifting. There's not much money. We're the last place that we're gonna get like incredibly high-tech AI being implemented into. I mean, most of the AI we see is like just Excel if-then formulas. So I really don't think we're gonna get anytime soon to where AI can actually replace those soft skills and then the ability to program with lifter psychology in mind. And that even extends to technique because yes, I think technique could be a little bit more objective in looking at certain things. I mean, obviously every lifter is different leverage-wise, but objective in the things we're trying to look at in sense of bar path and movement and whatnot to an extent. But with that being said, the coaching of technique is highly individual as well, and a lot of it based on psychology. You might have some lifters that I can explain the thought process behind technique, and they can organize that within their own head and internalize it and then be able to cue themselves. There's other people I've got to get a very specific cue to or else they're not going to be able to figure out what I'm saying. Or there's others that if I give any technical feedback, it just throws them through a loop overthinking, and we need more so to use movement constraints. And so within that, again, there's just so much psychology and soft skills and individuality within the coaching realm of things that I think AI is a bit of a fad that's just not really going to last within powerlifting. And if there's any chance that it does happen, it's going to be well into the future. So moving to the next question, how to balance between making training predictable and adding novelty to training. So this is going to be a little bit of a blunt answer. That's probably not the answer that you're necessarily looking for, but powerlifting is very monotonous and boring. We squat, we bench, we deadlift, and there's only so many iterations of that. And if you have something that's working, don't change it. That's going back to what I said, is like changing just to make changes in novelty. Like for the squat, bench, and deadlift and what you're doing there are only so many iterations of what you can possibly do. And that's going to be boring and monotonous. And if you do not like the boring, monotonous grind of squat, bench, and deadlift, just to be honest, maybe powerlifting isn't what you're looking for. But the novelty you can get is from accessories. That's where we can be a bit more novel and we can change things and we can adjust and we can try different strategies, we can try new machines. That's where we can have a little bit more fun and novelty within our training. So if someone's wanting more novelty and fun and just to try and change things up, that's probably where I'm gonna be looking at. I don't really want to change squat, bench, and deadlift if it's working. I mean, even if you do change it, it's still gonna be squat, bench, deadlift over and over and over. It's the same thing. Where I'm looking to add novelty and maybe adjust some things to give someone something fun or new is through accessories, and maybe changing the types of accessories we're doing, maybe adding some more bro stuff and more arm stuff if they're just motivated for that. Whatever it may be, I'm gonna look through novelty through accessories because frankly, that's where you actually can get novelty. I really don't think you're gonna find too much novelty in the SBD movements. For the next question, archetypes of exposure timing for SBD based on weight class. So, that one's probably a bit too tough to answer in a short little Q&A. I've actually got a video coming out on powerlifting now within the next couple of months of all my go-to splits in regards to frequency of twice a week or 3 times a week squat, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bench, 1 to 2 deadlift, all the kind of stuff. I think there are like 40 something different layouts I have. That might be more what you're looking for, but what I wanted to cover here and what I do think I can answer here is no matter what, I tend to bias to a very similar exposure timing between the main days, which means usually if you're squatting, benching, deadlifting twice a week or more, you're having a primary or secondary day, or in a sense, 2 primary days. A lot of times those are kind of the same thing. And then we have days, if we're going 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever the frequency may be, we're adding over 2, we're having days intermixed in between that. But no matter what, I think the biggest thing I try to do, and I stick with, is the exposure timing between a secondary and primary day, no matter what frequency you're doing, is going to have 2 to 3 rest days in between. What I mean by that is maybe it's a Monday secondary, rest Tuesday, Wednesday, primary Thursday. That would be 2 rest days and then squat. And then coming back around, you then have Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday secondary days. So 3 rest days. And so you could flip that. You could do primary on Friday, primary on Thursday. Either way, you have 2 to 3 rest days in between. I pretty much stick to that universally. I mean, there's obviously times where maybe you go outside of that, but I stick to that for the reason that anytime you adjust outside of that, now you're reducing it to 1 rest day, you're going to have to reduce the stress on whatever that prior day is. And outside of that, I'm probably looking at that as more of like a tertiary day type timing versus a secondary or primary day, because I'm gonna have to reduce the stress enough to allow the recoverability and just having a 48-hour turnaround going into that next session. So if there's one thing I could say is kind of like a staple, it would be if we're at 2 times or more, that primary to secondary day is always having that 2 to 3 day rest period or 72 to 96 hour rest time. For the next question, how would you approach programming for back-to-back meets, i.e. 6-week time frame? So first and foremost, the number one thing I'd say is you need to pick one meet to prioritize. It's going to be, in my opinion, very difficult to prioritize both of those meets or train the exact same way into both of those meets, barring you have a very, very different system of programming than I do. But if you're somewhat similar to myself, the biggest issue you're gonna run into is running that, in a sense, peaking block. If you run a stereotypical peaking block, prioritizing singles and things like that, you're very gonna often find if you run that successively 2 times in a row, you're going to lose some of the stimulus you need from more of the volume-based stuff or rep work-based stuff, as well as the fact that after you do that first meet, if you're peaking and tapering, that means you're dissipating fatigue, almost getting to a detrained state to then peak for that meet, and then definitely after the meet, you are detrained. Like a lot of people the week after the meet think they're just super beat up. More so what it is you're detrained. Like you're trying to peak for this day, and then after that, you're actually gonna be detrained. So we often need this time to kind of reacclimate, and most people, more I call average to especially lighter weight class lifters, are not gonna do well hopping right back into higher intensity single-based specificity. They're gonna need to do some type of repetition work to regain kind of that fitness level. So let's say we do try to prioritize both of them, even though I probably wouldn't recommend it. If we're gonna try and prioritize both, I'll use Waskar going into Worlds, for example, and we took a different approach. In hindsight, maybe we shouldn't have prioritized PA Nationals as much, but we did. And then we prioritized Worlds, and both went very, very well. And what we had to do is we took a different approach for Worlds than we did for PA Nationals. For PA Nationals, we took a very typical peaking approach that we had normally done. But then for going into Worlds, we decided to really not prioritize singles and keep driving rep work pretty much the entirety of prep. And then we never pushed singles as hard as we did in PA Nats prep, because for Waskar, I knew he needed that rep work to drive his top end strength. And if we just went right back to prioritizing singles, I knew we were gonna see a drop off. So we prioritized it differently, and in a good way, we were able to replicate the same strength at both meets, which was awesome. We peaked twice in a great manner. But we had to approach it different. So if we are going to have that short turnaround and you're going to prioritize that first meet as well, what I would say is go into that first meet, peak per normal, but for that second meet, you probably are going to need to take a different approach than your normal peaking block. You're going to need to drive some rep work or whatever may work in general to drive strength for someone, and take basically the fact that like, okay, I don't have to hit as heavy of singles in training, this block leading into the second meet, because I just did that in the meet. And all I need to do is take, okay, I hit X, Y, and Z on squat, bench, and deadlift. That's my goal for this next meet. And use your training and what you see as the training trends to determine to see if you're on the same track to hit those numbers, or if you need to adjust based on the actual, again, in this example, the rep work and how that's trending comparatively to how it normally does. For the next question, it's a little bit of a longer one, but athlete is able to rep a very high percentage of 1RM. Does that mean that 3 at 8, which I mean is like a triple at 8 RPE, is more fatiguing than usual, and it's better to lower RPE, go with percent 1RM? Or does RPE already account for that since he truly had 2 RIR? So this is a bit of a deep question. I do actually cover this in the high frequency bench video in decent detail of kind of showing the difference with people with differing percentage base charts. But the biggest thing I want to say is I don't believe RPE is the only thing that accounts for fatigue. I do not believe that 8 RPE across the board for any lifter is the exact same thing. Not only because I think there's a lot more variables that go into what accumulates fatigue, volume, intensity, a lot of other factors too. Not going to get fully into that here. But also, 8 RPE for one lifter can be very different for another lifter. And we just see that. We see some people hit 8 RPE over and over and over and they can tolerate it no problem. We see another lifter do it and then they're tanked and they need to kind of taper and deload from that. And there might be more reasons than this, but I see kind of three main reasons I feel like we see a difference in 8 RPE between different lifters. One is just the absolute load on the bar. Are you Ashton Rauska squatting 750 for 3 reps at 8 RPE, or are you Steve DeNovi squatting 400 pounds for 3 reps? Ashton's 8 RPE is probably just going to be a little bit more fatiguing than when I used to be full in my heyday powerlifting, squatting 400 for a triple. The second reason, as kind of alluded to in the question, 8 RPE is not the same percentage of 1 RM for one lifter versus another. People can have wildly different percentage-based charts where you might have one person who a triple at 8 RPE is like 94%, and then you might have another person where it's like 87%. So inherently, it's probably a bit more fatiguing for that person, which is what I think this question is kind of asking, doing it at a very high percent of their 1 RM than someone who's disproportionately not as good at that repetition-based work. And then lastly, depending on the lifter, we're going to look at distance traveled. And that, if you go look at my high frequency bench video, that was the main thing where I kind of related this back to, is when you have someone who has, like on bench, a 48 kilo female with a super high arch bench might be able to hit a relatively really high percentage of their 1 RM for a triple or a set of 4 or 5 or 6, versus a 6'5" male who's 120 kilos might be on the polar opposite end of the spectrum. And while there's differing factors there, one of the biggest ones is just distance traveled and the amount of work per rep lifted. Like the amount of work to do a 2-inch bench press range of motion is a lot less than if you have a super long arm full range of motion bench, and not only the distance travel and the rep per work, but also just the joint demands and then the angles of the joint that the joints are having to go through and how they're leveraging the muscles differently. Next question is a bit more specific to like coaching systems and structure, but it's what is your full process for planning for a meet? Attempts, potential scouting, client call, and whatnot. So for everyone, usually about a week out or so, whenever I've got a good idea based off of their heavy lifts and they've completed enough to where I have confidence in being able to let them know what I think for their attempts. I usually try not to do that before we hit the heavy lifts because it might kind of get numbers in their head of what they think they need to do. I'm going to put together my thought process for attempt selections, and then from there, I'm going to make a full video detailing that for them. And that video is going to be somewhat based on what the athlete wants and needs, because you got some athletes who want every little detail, they want the full strategy, they want every thought process. I've had other people who've literally told me, don't send me a video, I don't want to know what my numbers are, just let me know my openers and then call the rest for me. So it really depends on the person, but for 95% plus of people, I'm making a video outlining everything they need to know for the meet day with attempt selection, weight cut, variables on meet day, timing, all of that stuff, so I can really lay out the foundation for what is the plan on the day. And if I'm personally handling the lifter, that's about what is needed. But if there's someone who's handling a lifter for me, I'm also gonna, one, either share that video with them as well, or two, if it's a meet where there's maybe a more specialty case, or maybe it's a really, really big meet where we gotta talk a lot more about strategy with attempt selection based on competition, I'll probably have a direct call with that handler and or the athlete if they feel like they would like to be involved with that too, and really go through that in a lot more detail together so we can kind of bounce ideas off each other and go through a lot more situational stuff. Because when we're in more like actual competitive battles, worlds, nationals, stuff like that, there's more situational things versus just taking what we think should be the number on the bar that we think is our best option for a third attempt. And then lastly, kind of touching on the scouting portion. One, even though I have a full video on powerlifting now about scouting, and it's a lot of fun, I do a lot for Two White Lights, I do a lot for my clients too, it is a bit overrated. Like there's only so much you're going to get from that, and really only times I'm scouting is when I have someone in a very competitive head-to-head battle, and they're actually going for some type of placing. Otherwise, I'm not really worrying about that too much. If I've got someone who's looking at like a 7th through 10th placing at nationals, I'm not really going to scout too much because frankly, it doesn't matter. They just got to go hit their lifts, and then we'll see where the cards fall when we get there. We don't really need to worry too much about what other people are doing. And then even within that, if I've got someone trying to go for first, second, third podium at one of these bigger meets, head-to-head battle, scouting is great, but there's really two things mainly it's doing. It's one, making sure I'm not surprised by anything and have some lifter come out of the blue that I wasn't expecting to be involved in this head-to-head battle. And then two, it's kind of just more of a confidence thing. Like it takes out the unknowns. We like to control what we can control. We don't like unknowns going into meet day. So as a coach, it probably even more so than anything just kind of helps me with confidence going in and having a general idea of what to expect so that I don't feel like on the day I'm having to think about those things. Moving on to the next question. Mid or high bar squats as a primary competition technique. How can this technique be tweaked for powerlifting? So one, the technique really isn't changed. A squat is a squat. I actually have a post on this. If you search my past blog posts, you'll probably be able to find it. But I pretty much notate like how I'm going to cue a low bar squat and a high bar squat during the actual movement is the exact same. It's just that you're going to go through a little bit differing joint angles because of the nature of the bar position. Really, the only difference is the initial setup. But once you actually get out there, the technique is the same. Within that, obviously a lot of people go to low bar squats, and for good reason. That lower bar position decreases the moment arm to the hips, which usually decreases the amount of like hip extension demands you have and makes you generally a little bit stronger. But I actually have two people who are incredibly good squatters who high bar squat, Dominique Fuqua and Matt Chanone. And the things they have in common, as well as you'll see other people like Bryce Lewis, Connor Borkert doesn't really, I think he kind of high, yeah, Connor I think's high bar squatted when he was competing. They're going to have long torsos and short femurs, which means they're going to be relatively upright, so they're going to have lesser hip extension demands, as well as because of being upright, they're going to have less deviation of where their hips are going to be to where their center of mass is. So therefore, the difference in doing high bar versus low bar for them is pretty minimal strength-wise, but the cool thing about high or mid bar is there's just less demands on the upper body, shoulders, arms, and stuff like that, and less variables that get into place technique-wise with rib cage position, that if someone can be just as strong doing that, that's kind of cool. It kind of reduces some variables that kind of create, one, like I said, some technique issues with what the low bar position does with the rib cage and shoulder position, and then two, what it does fatigue-wise possibly to the shoulders, elbows, and biceps and things like that that might carry over to bench. So it is a very nice thing because it reduces some of the variables and some of the fatigue carryover you see even with like the lower back and stuff and the deadlift. So, but I think it takes a very specific type of leverage squatter to probably bias towards a mid or a high bar and feel just as strong, if not stronger, doing that than low bar. For the next question, how to program for imbalance and noticing when and if things need to fully be adjusted for. So I wasn't quite sure the direction here, if it was talking imbalance like side to side or if it was like imbalance between muscle groups. I'm gonna go with the side to side aspect of it because that's something I don't think I've talked about in a lot of detail and it'd be fun to answer. So if we have imbalances side to side, first and foremost, the number one thing I'm going to do is just program more unilateral accessory work. If we truly have like an imbalance leg to leg or arm to arm or pec, whatever it may be, one, we can use the unilateral stuff to be able to actually strengthen and let that like weaker or smaller side catch up. Or two, what probably happens more often than not is a lack of like motor control. Like if I'm right-handed, I have better like motor control of my right side and proprioception and just general like awareness and hand-eye coordination versus my left side. And sometimes that's kind of what we're getting when we feel an imbalance. We just have less control and ability to like manage stability and feeling on that side that we're just not as dominant in. As well as probably a lot of imbalances we see are more just like positional issues, but I'm talking about like actual side-to-side imbalances. So not only does like unilateral stuff help with actually like individualizing the stimulus and hypertrophy to try and let that weaker side possibly catch up, it also too allows us time to like develop that balance and motor control of that side that maybe we don't have as good a proprioception with. And something that's super cool as well is the body just doesn't really like to be asymmetrical. So I don't think it's actually very common for us to truly be imbalanced. Like in sense of like strength and musculature, I think it's usually one is more of like our ability, like our dominance of like right side versus left side and motor control. Two, positional, because there's actually some studies showing this, and I'm not going to pull them up. You can look them up yourself. But like in a rehab setting, anyone who does more physical therapy type stuff, when you like, let's say I injured my left knee. If I still train my right side, it's actually shown that it still can actually strengthen or help the left side as well. I don't know the functions and like things that go into that, but the body doesn't like to be asymmetrical. If you were to only try and strengthen one side, you're actually gonna find the other side kind of catches up. That's why we don't see like one arm being Popeye style and the other one arm looking like one of mine. It tends to kind of catch up with each other because we don't like to be asymmetrical. So that's another thing where I don't think a lot of times we actually see true side-to-side imbalances, especially within powerlifting where most people are decently trained. Next question is, if volume is low such that fatigue doesn't accumulate, is a taper not needed? No taper's needed. Taper is literally the strategy to reduce fatigue in some way to then allow fitness to kind of show through to its full capacity. So if we don't have any notable fatigue, A taper is actually just going to detrain you, which is a very viable strategy, and why I wanted to answer this question, because we see it more and more often now, because some people don't do well going into high fatigue, like the traditional like peak and taper method of like pushing into really, really heavy lifts and high fatigue and trying to super compensate off of that. Some people don't super compensate off of that because they have to pull back so much to dissipate that fatigue that it detrains them in the process, and there's no net positive from that. So there's a lot of people that kind of do pretty well in either a semi-no taper approach, or what probably is more likely is just a very minimal taper approach. But yeah, if you don't have fatigue, don't taper. That would actually be counterproductive to what you're trying to accomplish. Next question is, do you program different variations and accessories for bench press depending on grip width? And the answer to that specific question is probably no. I don't think as much about grip width. I think more about range of motion. But with that said, you very much could. The wider the grip you are, you tend to be leveraging more of your pecs. The narrower, the more you have to kind of leverage the triceps. So maybe you're going to bias based off of that. But more so what I probably am thinking about is range of motion, which goes hand in hand. Typically, the wider you are, the shorter range of motion. The narrower you are, the longer range of motion. It kind of all comes back together. But within that, yes, I definitely do. And frequency and bench frequency kind of plays into that. But on average, someone with a longer range of motion just kind of needs to get more jacked with their upper body. They're probably going to get the most bang for their buck from just getting bigger. And they're probably also going to see less fatigue carryover from more demanding accessory work, in my opinion. So for people with longer range of motion and or maybe closer grip, I'm going to bias towards what I'll call more like mass building upper body accessories like weighted dips, to where like weighted dips, you're not isolating anything, just everything in the upper body is being used, which is why I think they're a great movement, and why I think like bro science wise, you're not going to ever see someone who's repping out 3 or 4 plates on weighted dips who has a small upper body. They're all pretty much jacked because it's going to work your pecs, your shoulders, your triceps pretty decently evenly, to where it's just going to build the upper body as a whole. So I think it's a great bang for your buck exercise, especially within powerlifting, where we already are doing these super long workouts and we have limited time sometimes for accessories. I want to choose accessories that are going to get the most bang for their bucks. That's why I like those. When we have to get more musculature, how can we do that in the most efficient manner? So I think a lot of times the long range of motion or closer benchers are going to do better with these like mass building, like weighted dip style accessory movements. On the opposite end of the spectrum, the longer range or wider grip benchers, they need that kind of like hypertrophy too, but it tends to be more disruptive from my experience. When I get my 4, 5, 6 times a week bench pressers, the more we drive accessory work, it tends to be a bit more disruptive for them. And so it's very, very common that I'm probably going to bias more towards, I don't want to say isolated, but more specific low stress accessory movements like a machine chest press. That's probably not going to induce as much fatigue, and it's going to be a bit more targeted maybe to the pecs in some manner like we want it to. And then maybe during certain times of the year where we're away from competition and we don't mind some type of fatigue masking or a pullback on actual bench intensity, we might drive more of like those mass building type ones, knowing it's going to cause some disruption to bench press. But that would be my answer in short. Longer range of motion, closer grip, more like mass building type accessory, like chest or upper body accessory work, and my more wide grip, high arch, short range of motion people, I would probably bias more towards more like specific machine type work. And then the last question I'm going to be covering today is how to figure out feet positioning for bench press. So 1, David Wilson, I believe, has a good video on this. 2, end of this year, I actually have a video fully coming out about this on Powerlifting Now, but I'll give a short little breakdown here that might be helpful. So let's talk like foot position in the sense of further out or further under us, because that's kind of probably the main thing we're kind of looking at. The benefit of having our feet further out is we have more control over our leg drive. The further it's out, the more we actively control it, versus the more they're under us, the more it's just kind of a passive leg drive and it's just kind of there, but it's kind of hard to control the intensity of the leg drive. So that is one variable that would kind of go into it. But within that, and something I learned from Sean Noriega that kind of brought this to my attention, is it's probably almost more dictated, instead of active versus passive, is where are we getting our arch, which also likely leads back to how long is your torso. People who tend to have get their arch from higher up their back, which also tends to be people with shorter torso lengths, tend to do better with their feet further out, comparatively. Not always, but comparatively. versus the opposite, when you find someone who gets their arch from lower in their back and probably is a longer torso, you're gonna find that they're gonna typically do better with their feet a little bit further under them. Now that's not a universal rule, but if you go look at people that tend to really like excessively bias their feet out in front of them, you're probably gonna see that their arch looks like it's pretty high up their back and they have a shorter torso. And then the opposite, you look at people who typically have their feet way under them, it tends to be longer torso people and or people who get their arch from lower on their back, and that's where they find benefit from that. So that concludes this Q&A. So thank you for everyone who submitted questions. I hope that was helpful for everyone. So like I said, if in future videos, if you'd like to submit a question, make sure to be looking out for my stories on Instagram, submit a question. And then as always, if you have any questions on what I've discussed, leave a comment below and I'll be happy to answer. If you're not subscribed, please do so. Give the video a like if you found it useful and share it with some friends if you feel like one of these topics may apply to them. But until next time, peace.